All right, so let's start. And if more people come in, they'll come in a bit late and it'll be fine. So today we have here with us BIBLARIDION. So such a famous name that we don't need his last name or even his first name. BIBLARIDION joined YouTube in 2016, and ever since then he's been putting out educational videos about conlang, world building, and more recently, speculative biology. So personally, I've loved all of those topics, and so I've been a big fan of BIBLARIDION for a really long time, and it's really an honor to get to introduce him now. I know so many people in the conlang community who got their starts thanks to him and his Intro to Conlang video series, and his Conlang Showcase series inspired many others, myself included, to make their own Conlang Showcase videos and put them on YouTube. BIBLARIDION continues to be a leading figure in the Conlang community, from attending more classic Conlang events like the LCS's Language Creation Conference last winter, to inspiring thousands of younger Conlangers daily with his videos. He is a bridge between the old and the new style of Conlanger, and a much needed bridge at that. And so he recently reached 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is a very big feat, especially when making videos on subjects usually considered more niche. And so I would love to congratulate him on that, and it is an incredible honor to be able to present to you BIBLARIDION. And he'll take it away with his presentation.
Wow, thank you for that. That was quite an introduction. The honor is all mine. That's very humbling because yeah, I'm going to hedge right from the top and just make it very clear from the beginning. I am not a linguist. I have never had any kind of training in linguistics at all. Everything I know is entirely self-taught, so that there is a non-zero chance that everything that I'm about to say is just complete nonsense. So I apologize in advance for that. So yeah, I'm here today to talk to you about conlanging. So question one, if this is going to actually work for me. Is that going to work? Doesn't seem to be working. Yes, there we go. So what is a conlang? Well, a conlang, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, that's right. The word conlang is now officially in the Oxford English Dictionary as of 2014, I believe. And it defines it as a language that has been artificially created, a constructed language. And the etymology is, I think, pretty transparent. And this contrasts with the idea of a natural language, which is, for lack of a better term, essentially what some might call a real language, as in a language that has come about through natural linguistic processes of linguistic evolution, being spoken by, by a fairly large body of speakers over many generations. Whereas a conlang typically is a language that's created by a much smaller number of individuals, often just one, for a specific purpose, which we'll get more into that in a little bit. So the fact that it's a constructed language is important. Language is a key word here, because things that don't qualify as conlangs are things like, well, for one, just complete gibberish. If you're just stringing random sounds together with no underlying structure or anything to it, that's not a language, just nonsense. What also doesn't count as a conlang is a code or a cipher, where you take an existing language and just apply some sort of algorithm to it that spits out some new sequence, like we've got here, where we just transpose the letters over a bit. That's not a language in and of itself. It's just a modification of a language that already exists. And then we have an edge case with something like relexes, where whether or not this counts as a conlang in its own right is a little bit debatable. But a relex is essentially when you take an existing language and you swap out all of the words, all of the lexical items with new vocabulary, but you keep the underlying structure exactly the same. So like in this example, you can see it's all, it's pretty Englishy. There's pretty much a one-to-one correspondence with all the words. They all come in exactly the same order. And even the grammatical inflection is identical. We have this al suffix that's responding exactly the same as the ing suffix in English, even though the ing suffix in that sample sentence is being used in two fairly different ways. In one case, in the first instance, it's being used as a participle to modify woman, and in the second, it's being used to form the progressive construction. So two fairly different uses, and yet in our relex, it's still being, the same suffix is still being used for both cases, which is a bit odd. So yeah, whether what you want to call this a language in its own right is kind of debatable. Really is just a reskinned version of English. So that's usually not what we're talking about when we're talking about conlangs proper. What we mean is something like this, and I hate using my own stuff as an example, but this is one of my conlangs. This is Nakachti, where it's got its own script, not a very good one, but it's all right, I guess, for now. But in this example sentence, we have, let me try and pronounce this, makralitam intokon kantanasok amepsek. There we go. And that means the army has slept in the wooden fort before. And it's pretty obvious, or at least I hope so, that it's not just a ripoff of English. It clearly has its own structure. The words don't match one for one. And it's clear that there are grammatical things going on that are distinctly non-Englishy. There's cases, there's verb agreement to a much greater extent than it exists in English. And just for fun to have a look at just one of these words, let's focus on the first word, makralitam, which we're translating in the English example as army. But if you break it down, the root is the kr there. The kr comes from a verb that means to fight. You put the ali suffix on the end, and that is the agentive suffix. So it turns it into, turns a verb stem into a noun that means the person who does whatever the verb is. So in this case, krali means fighter. You put the ma prefix on the beginning. That is the honorific prefix. So it literally means like an honorable fighter, kind of. And that is the word for soldier. And then the tam ending is what we call the associative plural, which means that it's not as simple as just an additive plural of saying soldiers. It means soldiers and everything that you would typically associate with soldiers, all their weaponry, all their equipment, all that stuff. So makralitam can loosely be translated as army here. And also an extra bit of fun. In the English example, army in English is just a single thing. So that triggers singular agreement with the verb. So it's the army has slept, not the army have slept. Whereas in Nakachti, because this, even though it's being translated as army, it actually is technically plural because it's an associative plural. That triggers plural agreement with the verb, not singular agreement. So yeah, you can see pretty quickly that there's some more stuff going on under the surface. It's not just a funny version of English. So that's more along the lines of what we're talking about when we say constructed language. Now, constructed languages have a very long and storied history that's far too complicated for me to get into here, going back almost 1,000 years at this point in one way or another. But
yeah, it appears BIBLARIDION is frozen. We'll wait a minute to see if they can come back online. Yeah.
All right, you were lagging, but now you're back. So yeah. Okay.
You're muted.
unmute. There we go. Is that working?
There you go.
Yep, we can see, by the way, the
technology.
all right, there we go. Yeah.
Yep.
Where was I when I dropped off?
It was about 1,000 history for about 1,000 years or so.
Oh, perfect. So not very long. Excellent.
No.
Yeah. So arguably the two most famous conlangers of all time are Ludwig Lazar Zamenhof on the left here, who created Esperanto, which is a language that he designed to facilitate international communication, at least within Europe. Because his idea was that if everyone could speak the same language, then there would be this massive influx of cultural exchange and people could share ideas more easily, and it would ultimately usher in world peace. Now, still waiting on that whole world peace thing, but what has happened in the meantime is that there is now a thriving Esperanto community, including native speakers, because there are people who meet at Esperanto conventions who don't share any language other than Esperanto. And then if they go off and have children, they have children that grow up speaking Esperanto, which is pretty cool. And then the other person who you'll probably be familiar with is J.R.R. Tolkien, who is famous for Lord of the Rings, and his extensive linguistic work that he put into his books. We still don't know exactly how thoroughly he developed a lot of his languages, but from what we can tell, he had over a dozen different conlanging projects throughout his life, starting from his teens. And it was actually his work that introduced me to conlanging and linguistics in the first place. And I can still remember the example that this first occurred to me. I was reading the Silmarillion in university, and there's a whole lot of names in the Silmarillion for all sorts of different things. And I just sort of noticed this pattern in some of them. We've got Mordor, Moria, Minas Morgul, Morgoth, and I realized, there's a whole lot of mores going on here. And I wondered, is there a reason for that? Is he just reusing the same syllable over and over again, or is there some purpose? And if you look up in the appendices, he provides meanings for these words, and we can see, yeah, it's pretty transparently dark land, dark pit, tower of dark, sorcery, dark enemy. So it seems like a pretty reasonable conclusion that mor means dark. And that might seem very simple and straightforward, but to me, this was the first evidence that I had that there was actual derivation and systematicity behind the language. It wasn't just gibberish that he was making up on the spot. And I thought that was really, really cool. And once I noticed this, I started seeing more and more examples like this in the other names that were cropping up that showed there is definitely a grammar behind this. And there's a lot of work and thought put into it that made the world in the story feel a lot more rich and detailed, which I thought was a very, very cool effect to have, which I then tried to mimic in some of my work with varying success. I won't go into that, but essentially that's what started me down the path of just playing around with languages and trying to make my own and learning from natural languages as well. So next question is, how do you make a conlang? There's a bunch of steps involved. And that'll vary based on a number of factors, but just to blaze through these, the first and most important step by far is to have an understanding of what your end goal is. Why are you making this language in the first place? Because depending on what your answer is to that question, that will inform a lot of the decisions that you make about the language. And there's a whole bunch of different possibilities for what the language could be for. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people would want to make languages in the first place. Some of the main ones include auxiliary languages like Esperanto that we mentioned earlier, which are designed to facilitate international communication. And looking at this sample here, I mean, it's pretty, like anyone with even a passing familiarity of the Romance languages should be able to pick their way through this fairly easily. And that's by design, because it's supposed to be as familiar and easy to pick up to European language speakers as possible. Whereas I've lumped these all together. They are subtly different, but they sort of have the same vibe. Philosophical, logical, or experimental languages are languages that try to describe the universe in language as accurately or efficiently or as logically as possible. And the example I have here is from Ithquil by John Quijada, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that, but it's a single phrase that means, on the contrary, I think it might turn out that this rugged mountain range trails off at some point. And all of that information is just crammed into that one phrase. And every single one of these phonemes, every single one of these sounds has some grammatical meaning that interfaces with all the others. It's ludicrously complicated. Now, if this was being presented as an auxiliary language, one designed to be easy to learn and to facilitate international communication, then it would be an abysmal failure, because I think it's safe to say that no human could ever actually learn how to speak Ithquil with any degree of fluency, because it just requires a level of precision that the human mind is not able to attend to consistently. So yeah, in that sense, it would be a terrible auxiliary language, but it's not supposed to be an auxiliary language. It's a philosophical language, or rather an experimental language. John Quijada set out with a specific goal of encoding as much information as unambiguously and succinctly as possible. And in that sense, it's been, I think, pretty big success. Next up, we have personal languages. This is the easy one, because for a personal language, the beginning and end of all decision making is, do I like it? And that's the only criterion. And so this example is Teonath, which is a language by Sarah Higley, where I can't speak for why she made these decisions, other than presumably she liked them, and that's all that really matters. But we can note in this example of the phrase, the boy gives a book to the man, we can see that the subject, which is the boy is the one giving the book, but in the Teonath translation, the boy actually comes toward the end of the sentence, just before the verb, and the first word in the sentence is actually the word for book. So we can see Teonath actually follows an object-subject-verb structure, which is incredibly rare and unusual cross-linguistically. I think there's only like 2 languages ever that could be said to have that. But that doesn't matter, because this is a personal language. So if Sarah Higley likes it, then that's all that really matters. That would matter, however, if we were looking at a naturalistic language. And a naturalistic language is the type of language that I have the most experience in making. These are languages that are designed to mimic the quirks and idiosyncrasies of real natural languages as closely as possible. Typically for a fictional community of speakers, so Elvish, for example, or Dothraki or Klingon, or the languages created for these fandoms where there are these imaginary speakers. Typically, you will want to have those be naturalistic languages to make it make sense that these would be spoken. And just for an example, I have High Valyrian by David J. Peterson, as seen in the show Game of Thrones. And what he's done here, you can see that nouns fall into different declensions, like they do in a lot of languages, especially European languages. And just as a quick example, we can see that the plural of vala is vali, but the plural of loctus is loctusi. You add a si ending instead of just changing the vowel to an e like you do with vala, then avaro becomes avara. So there's clearly multiple different pluralization patterns, which, again, if this was an auxiliary language, that would be pretty bad idea, because that would make it harder to learn. But because natural languages do this, you should try to mimic things like this in naturalistic languages. So that's a good thing in this example. Right, so you have a good idea of what your goal is. The next step is to sort out a phonology. And all languages, pretty much by definition of what a language is, will have some sort of fundamental unit that you put together to make into words to convey meanings. And of course, in a spoken language, those units are sound, but if you're making a sign language or a musical language or what have you, those units could be something different. But we're going to focus on sounds for now. So this on the screen is a very simplified version of the International Phonetic Alphabet. Shows a pretty decent range of the possible sounds that the human vocal tract is capable of producing. No language could use all of them realistically, or at least no naturalistic language could use all of them realistically. So
have you heard of Ubich?
We will get to that. We will get to that, trust me, in a few moments. So it's your job as the conlanger then to choose an inventory that makes sense with what your goals are. So for an international auxiliary language, you probably want a smaller inventory with lots of sounds that are present in lots of languages, etc. Whereas for a naturalistic language, you want to choose sounds based on that are reflective of the sorts of inventories that exist in natural languages. So for example, I just grabbed a random one, Togolawan, which is a Polynesian language, and we can see it's got a pretty small inventory. The Polynesian languages in general are known for having quite small sound systems, not very many consonants present. I think Hawaiian has 6 or 7, and Ratukas has 6, I can't remember, but pretty small inventories. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have which has over 100, according to some analyses. And there are also some Khoisan languages that have equally large, preponderous inventories as well. So you have to decide roughly how many sounds your language has, what those sounds are, and then you can, if you want, go into further detail with things like suprasegmentals. Does the language have tone, nasalization, all sorts of other things like that. But just as important as what sounds you're using to create meanings is how those sounds can be arranged. So if I had never heard of English before, if English was totally alien to me, and you gave me this and you told me these are all the consonants that exist in English, we're skipping the vowels because vowels are very variable depending on dialect. But if you told me these are all the consonants that English has, I might come away with the false impression that these are viable English words because all of those sounds exist in English, right? So we can have rabth, jbiu, and ktop, which I think anyone with even the faintest familiarity in English could be able to pretty confidently tell you those could never be English words. They just don't sound English because they violate the way English allows syllables to be put together. Like, for example, in that first word, rabth, that first sound, the velar nasal, English does not allow that sound to come at the beginning of words. We've got it at the end of words, like sing, but never at the beginning of words. So that just sounds wrong to us. So you need to define how your syllables can be put together in a conlang. And for a naturalistic language, we can have a look at what natural languages do to try and mimic that. And there's a pretty broad spectrum all the way from Maori, and again, a lot of the other Polynesian languages on the left here, where you have syllables like kotiro, tangata, aporo, and they're all consonant vowel, consonant vowel, consonant vowel. You can have several vowels in a row as well, but the important thing is that no two consonants are allowed to come into contact with each other. There has to be a vowel. That is now, yeah. I ask you to remain muted until I finished. So in Nahuatl, on the other hand, you do have consonants coming into contact. You can still have just consonant vowel, like in that first word, tinemi. But in the second word, you have tlatoani, where that H is how they romanize the glottal stop. So that counts as two consonants coming into contact. And then that last word, mistli, that the TL is the tl sound is a lateral affricate. So those count as, that counts as a single consonant, but it's coming into contact with the Z. So we've got the SL cluster. And then we can go all the way to the extreme of something like Nuchalk, where, I mean, there are vowels, but they don't really seem to be very fond of them because you can get these pretty insane words like, oh boy, no, that was bad. I can't do it, but something like that, where our concept of what counts as a syllable kind of breaks down at that point. So for a conlang, you have to decide how crazy you want to get and what your syllables actually look like. So by the time you've made all of these decisions about phonology, you should end up with something that looks kind of like this. This is another one of my languages. This is Alothwi. Admittedly, a rather unusual phonology, probably my most adventurous one. You can see one of the strange things is that under the labial column, the only sound it has is M, and I guess W if you want to count that, but there's no P, B, F, V, none of that. And there's also quite a bias towards uvular sounds as well. But all of the decisions that I made making this were based on natural precedent. So that lack of labial sounds, we can see that in languages like Tlingit, the Iroquoian languages, and some of the other Native American languages too. And that predilection for uvular sounds, preserving the voiced uvular stop, the sound, is very rare, but Mongolian and a few others do it. So it's all, I think, at least fairly naturalistic. That's what I'm aiming for. And Ilothwi syllables look like this, which looks pretty intimidating, and it is sometimes. But all that really means is that Ilothwi is very happy to make these big, nightmarishly long clusters. It's allowed to have syllabic consonants, so certain consonants can actually serve as the nucleus of the syllable, except in word final syllables. If the syllable is the last syllable of the word, there's only a very small number of vowels and a very small number of consonants that are allowed to go in that syllable. Final syllables get special treatment. So we end up with words like and fulgumofu, which gives it a pretty characteristic sound. So we go to grammar, and this is when things get rapidly spiral into all sorts of different avenues and possibilities that would be impossible for me to go through exhaustively. There's just so many decisions you can make in this part. This is the really fun bit for me. But some very broad things you want to keep in mind is the degree of synthesis. How synthetic is the language? Synthesis is the amount of information that is encoded in a single word. So of the two extremes, we have analytic languages like Mandarin or the other Chinese languages, where you have, like in this sentence, 我们在看狗, that mun there, that is one of the very, very, very few things in Mandarin that can be said to be a suffix. Pretty much everything else, all other elements of grammar are encoded by separate words and particles that you just move around and use at your own discretion. There's very little in the way of affixation. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we have polysynthetic languages like Yupik, where we've got this word, where tuntu is the root that means reindeer, but all of this other stuff, he had not yet said again that he was going to hunt reindeer. All of that, other than reindeer, is just suffixes, and they are forbidden from standing on their own as independent words. They all rely on other words to affix onto. So very, very highly synthetic. And if the language is going to have synthesis, you have to decide how that synthesis manifests, whether it's agglutinating, like Turkish, where each piece of information is very clearly separable. Like in this word, we can see there are 3 suffixes, and it's very easy to parse which one does what. You can just sort of stack them together. Whereas in a language like Latin, where it's more fusional, you've got this word here, domibus, where the ibus ending simultaneously encodes the locative, the plural, and the fact that the noun is feminine, all in one. And you can't really tease apart what part of that suffix is doing what. It's all just sort of melded together. Presumably, at one point, those would have been 3 separate things. But now, just because of the erosion of time, they've all just kind of melded together. So that's just another choice that you have to consider. Oh yeah, I forgot about this. So it would be impossible, as I say, to give a comprehensive talk about everything that grammar involves, but I think just a fun example from my own work. So this is Okolawak, and in Okolawak, probably the most important aspect of the grammar is that all nouns are divided into this noun class system, where there are 5 different classes. I felt obligated to give them fancy names, but really it's just a very basic animacy hierarchy. We've got humans, animals, instruments, objects, and abstracts, basically. And this is very, very important because not only do nouns, verbs, and prepositions all take inflection to agree with the referent in terms of class, but also if you were to say a sentence like this, the fish gave a rock to the woman, while that would technically be grammatically correct, a native speaker would tell you that it sounds badly phrased because in addition to all the agreement morphology that goes on, each of these different classes has a different likelihood or different associations of agenthood or subjecthood. So if there is a human involved, basically that is the noun that is expected to be the subject. All else being equal, the speakers of this language will try and put the human as the subject. So in this case, the fish gave a rock to the woman. That's no good because the woman is the indirect object there. She's the one being given to. So instead, an Okolawak speaker would want to phrase it like this. The woman was given to by the fish with a rock. And you can see now that what's happened with the verb is that there is a passive and an applicative on it that has promoted the woman to the status of the subject, and all the other arguments are just sort of stranded at the end like that. So yeah, a lot of things involving discourse, syntax, lots of stuff to play around with the grammar. It's great fun. And then we come to lexicon, and this is the bit that can go on essentially indefinitely. Because if you think about how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of words a given language has, it would take more than your entire lifetime to actually do it in any sort of comprehensive fashion. But at the same time, this is where you get to have some fun thinking about how the speakers would conceptualize the world around them and how they would come up with these words based on what their language is like. So as an example, looking at Nakashti again, we've got this word istak, which is the generic word for lightning. But then by applying a bunch of different morphology to it, we can generate some more words. So at the top there, Nakashti has a singulative suffix. So it's basically the opposite of a plural. It's a specific suffix that you put on the noun to mean that there is exactly one of this thing. So if you take a lightning, put a singulative on it, it means like one of lightning, which is how you say lightning bolt. Then if you take the associative plural that we were talking about earlier and put it on lightning, it means lightning and everything that goes along with it, which is basically how you say thunderstorm. And then the last one, I still don't know exactly what to call it. I call it the substantive, but I know that's not actually a correct term for it. Basically, it's a prefix that you put on the noun to say the thing that this noun is made of. So imistak literally means the substance of the lightning, the thing that lightning is made of, which is electricity. And with that one, you can actually go even further, because if you stick a genitive at the end of that, it means of electricity. And it's very productive in Nakashti to derive new adjectives by sticking the genitive at the end. So that is the word for electric or electrical. And you can go on and on with these things. You can make these great fun derivational trees, deriving new words to your heart's content. Oh yeah, and the last step, which is optional, step 4.5, is a writing system. And first of all, decide if you want to have a writing system, because it's perfectly valid to have a language without one. Even a naturalistic language, there are plenty of natural languages that have never had any kind of writing system, and they get on fine without it. But assuming you do want a writing system, there are a couple of things to consider. First of all, and possibly the most obviously, is how the writing system actually works. What type of a script is it? And these are the basic 5 types. You've got alphabets, where every glyph represents exactly one sound. You've got an abjad, which is like an alphabet, except for various historical reasons, there are no separate characters for vowels. And this is something like Hebrew and Arabic. A lot of the Semitic languages work like this. Syllabaries, every symbol encodes both a consonant and a vowel. And abugidas are a lot like syllabaries, except whereas in a syllabary, the symbols are unanalyzable. So if you look at this symbol from Cherokee, the Sioux symbol, it's not like one part of the symbol means S and the other part means U, and you put them together to make the Sioux sign. That symbol just innately means Sioux. And if I were to show you the Sa symbol, it would look completely different. Whereas with an abugida, typically what happens is you start with a base consonant symbol, and then you modify it in some way, like this little flag bit that's coming up here on the top. That's representing the vowel that comes after this consonant here. And in this case, in Sinhalese, you can also indicate secondary consonants as well, which is quite fun. And then the final type is a logography, in which the symbols are read for their meanings, not for their sounds. So in this symbol, it means dog. And depending on where you are in Asia, this symbol could be pronounced many, many, many different ways, but pretty much no matter where you go, it means dog regardless. So those are the broad types of systems. I don't think it's ever possible to get a pristine system that only does one of these things. Usually there's a little bit of mixing going on or some other kind of irregularity. So you have to consider that as well. But also very important to consider is how the system is actually being written. Because that's going to have a huge impact. The tool and the medium that's being used to write it is going to have a big impact on the way it looks. So this is cuneiform, the language of the ancient Middle East. And I remember first seeing cuneiform and thinking, why would they possibly want to waste their time drawing out all of these little triangles and shading them in like that? That must have taken ages. But of course, it's not drawn with a pencil. It's made by impressing this triangular shaped reed into wet clay tablets, which naturally leaves behind these triangular shapes. So that makes a lot more sense. And it just, leaves this natural, very characteristic look. Oh yeah, for another example, the Latin alphabet, originally the Latin alphabet was carved into stone, which gave it this very sort of blocky, angular shape, mostly straight lines. But then the invention of parchment and paper and ink quills, that encouraged more curvy shapes. So that's how we got our distinction between upper and lowercase letters. And so this is the sort of thing that we mimic in conlangs, that I did something similar here with this script on the left here is from a language called Tsapukama. And in Tsapukama, you have this, I'll call it a syllabary for simplicity, but it's written by carving into wood with an obsidian knife. But then there's other group of people, the Okolayo, found out about this system. They didn't have writing before this point, and they thought it was a pretty nifty idea. So they borrowed the script, but they used ink and parchment instead of carving into wood. And that encouraged this pretty drastic change in shape, where now everything's become a lot more curvilinear. Oh yeah, I forgot about this as well. And one final thing about writing systems is that all writing systems, I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that all writing systems lag behind the spoken language to at least some degree. No writing system is perfect. There's always going to be some weirdness in there. Some are worse than others, like English. It's pretty popular to pick on English as having a pretty bad spelling system, which it does. So you have this word that looks like it should be pronounced knicht or something like that. It's pronounced night. It used to be pronounced knicht back in Old English, but then there was a whole bunch of sound changes, so now it's pronounced night, and we've never bothered to change the spelling. And then there's Tibetan. Tibetan is often touted as having the worst spelling system of all time. I shouldn't say worst, but least intuitive and hardest to intuit. So we have this word that phonetically it's spelled grogs, but it's actually pronounced ta. So yeah, that's good luck with that. And so in a conlang, we'd want to do something similar again. So this is the sort of thing I did in another one of my languages, Adun, where you got this word, which means resolution or commitment. And you think it would be pronounced, just looking at the way it's spelled, you think it would be pronounced ngahikita, but actually it's pronounced vecht. And there are reasons for that. It used to be pronounced ngahikita back in the proto-lang, but then long story short, a whole bunch of sound changes happened that just whittled it down into the state that it's in now. But the speakers are extremely traditionalist, and they have not updated their spelling since the writing system was first created, leaving these horrible fossilized forms that nobody except very well-educated people can actually afford to learn. So after all that, you ultimately end up with something that resembles something that could be called a fully fleshed out conlang. And so you may be wondering at this point, why? Why would you bother doing this? What's the point in making a language like this? And the answer is going to vary depending on who you talk to. Like I said earlier, there are lots of different goals that you can have for the conlang. But beyond those, number one is it's fun. I think that's a pretty decent reason. If you find something that you enjoy doing as a hobby, like I think that's a fine justification in and of itself. But also, learning conlanging, it is impossible to conlang and not learn something about linguistics while you're doing it. Like I'm proof of that, because as I say, absolutely everything I learned about linguistics, I learned from just doing conlanging and just experimenting with my own ideas. I've never had any sort of formal training at all. And it also introduces new people to linguistics, because again, from my own experience, the entire reason I got into this in the first place is just because I liked Lord of the Rings. And I just thought the Elvish language was just kind of cool. And I know a lot of other conlangers who have similar stories of, I should say as well, I took language courses in school. I took French in middle school and Latin in high school, and I hated them. I thought they were horrifically boring, and I had no desire to do anything language related after high school. But just because of this strange twist of fate, I found Lord of the Rings more compelling as a language class than my high school education. It's very strange, but that's proof that conlangs can encourage more people to join and become familiar with linguistics. And as these fandoms are growing of things like Game of Thrones and Star Trek and all those others that have their own conlangs associated with them, that's a whole other avenue to introduce brand new audiences into the field. And it's this wonderful sort of cyclical snowballing feedback loop that'll, it's only getting bigger and bigger. It's now the standards for invented languages in Hollywood is becoming increasingly, what's the word, incentivized. Like gibberish is no longer acceptable, is often said. So yeah, things are only going to get better from here. And so I think that conlanging has a tremendous potential for linguistics for, I think I've said my bit really, all of those reasons. And I think I'm gonna end it there with Pahaspimo Tanton, which is a Nakashti phrase that means thank you for listening. And I think that's all I got.
Is very cursed.
It's very
Thank you for your presentation. And
yeah, thanks for the presentation.
May is like very cursed.
Here, I'll read it too for you. I made it. Nash Shbakaluhom Pramay Lan La Gos Marshantai Somna Rumna Hamper.
I don't know what that is.
Guys, so you guys can continue talking about that in the Discord server as well, which we can link in the chat.
Yeah.
For now, thank you so much, BIBLARIDION, for this presentation, which was basically like a somehow amazingly condensed version of your YouTube videos that was, yeah. So thank you, and if you guys have questions for him, put them in the chat or raise your hand.
Thank you. So can I access chat from here?
you should be able to, but if you can't, one of us can read them out for you if you need.
Yeah.
Cool. I think I've got it. Blimey, there's a lot of stuff. Okay, I'm just gonna blaze through these. The UPick word is a classic. It is. UPick is great fun. Looking for questions.
Most of them are down at the bottom. You don't have to read the stuff at the top.
So the voiced, the prenasalized uvula stop going to V. Yeah, that's a whole bunch of different changes involved in that. So what was originally in Proto-Thracian, it was pronounced ngla, but then first of all, prenasalization was lost, so it just became gla. And then ngla is a pretty unstable sound, and in a lot of languages, it will go to ra, the uvular trill, and then from there it weakened to wa, and no, yeah, wa. Did I miss a step? No, yeah, it goes to wa, and then in certain environments it becomes va, especially word initially. So yeah, it was quite a sequence of changes that produced that. Just one of the fun, weird things that happens in Adun. Thank you very much, Eliza. I'm glad you enjoyed. So Marcella, how do we make sure we don't fall into the trap of just copying the grammar of a language we already know? The only thing I think I can really say is just look far afield. Like have a look outside your, I don't want to say comfort zone, but have a look at languages beyond the ones that you're familiar with. Because when I started out, I knew a little bit of Latin because of my high school classes, and so I basically stuck with that. But I ended up going to Turkey for a bit, and because I was kind of getting into languages at that point, I started looking up what Turkish is like, and it was so completely different from what I was used to. I started borrowing elements from that, and then I found my favorite language, classical Nahuatl, which was just mind-blowingly awesome, and then I started borrowing from that. So it's good to, yeah, just look into as many different language families as you can, and see what you like and see what works together. That's really the only advice I have on that. How many words does your largest language have? It kind of depends how you define word, because whether or not grammatical inflection counts as having a separate word or not. I admit that the number of words that my languages have is usually my smallest. Excuse me?
You go.
Okay, it's muted now. The number of words that my languages have is usually the weakest or the least developed part. I think my biggest language has something like 1,500, which isn't actually all that much in the grand scheme of things. I spend a lot more time and focus on the grammar and the other elements. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's supposed to be a vowel in there. I'm glad you found the presentation interesting, Marcella. For how long do you evolve the phonological system in proto-languages? It depends on the time depth that you're dealing with. If the proto-lang was only spoken a few hundred years ago, then probably not very many changes need to happen. Whereas if you're dealing on the order of many thousands of years, then might need to have some more changes involved. And even then, there isn't really a set number of changes that happen over a certain amount of time. That'll vary depending on the language family. That's a good question, Alexandra. What can you do with a personal language? Yeah, that's a good question. And I think only really the creator can answer that. There are some conlangers like Tony Harris and other people whose names I'm currently forgetting, but there are some of them who have learned their own personal language to fluency and have the stuff that they do is quite fascinating. They've got like books that they write in their own languages and their own art that they create, all sorts of things. So I guess a personal language has its own personal applications for the creator. A favorite sound? I do like the dental fricative, even though it's quite Englishy. And I do like uvulas as well. I probably overuse uvulas. Where do you usually start with developing a new idea for a conlang? Usually it's just some random like grammatical idea that comes to me. I think, oh, what if we had a language with verbs that inflected to agree with the shirt color that the speaker was wearing, or something stupid like that. And then I just sort of get carried away and then develop a sketch out of that and just see where it goes. Would trying to speak, use a conlang help with coming up with phonological evolution ideas? Yeah, if you just sort of roll the sounds around in your mouth, sometimes you can come up with interesting ways that the words can change. Would it be possible for 2 or 3 umlauts? Oh, it's gone now. 2 or 3 umlauts to happen in the same language in different directions. Wow. I don't know. That does sound a bit excessive, but who knows? Weird things can happen sometimes. At that point, it would kind of seem like vowel harmony happening if it was bidirectional and that was influencing vowel qualities across the whole word. Is there any conlang that has some grammar feature that is not found in any of the known natural languages? If it's a non-naturalistic conlang, then certainly, but for naturalistic languages, yeah, that would kind of go against the goal. Not necessarily. Sometimes you can find weird quirks that are unattested, but there's this thing in conlang, this idea anadu, which stands for a natlang's already done it, except worse or weirder, depending on who you talk to, which is you think you've come up with something brand new and interesting, and then later on you find out that there's actually a natlang that does that exact same thing. So your idea isn't actually as original as you'd thought. So yeah, depends on what your goal is. And I think that, oh wait, something's popped up. What is the most unusual marking you have in your conlangs? Oh, most unusual marking. Nothing's coming off the top of my head. Nakachi has a bunch of derivational stuff that's it's a bit funny. It's got a distinction between an honorific and a pejorative. That's not really that weird. Illothwi has a direct inverse system, which took me ages to wrap my head around. That's something else I should have brought up as well, is that conlangs can actually help you understand grammar better. Like, I had no idea how direct inverse systems worked before I decided to use one of them in Illothwi, and that actually helped me wrap my head around those sorts of systems, which are used, by the way, in the Algonquin languages in North America and a few others from around the world as well.
All right, so we have time for probably like 2 more questions, and then we got it ended it. So
cool. I missed one. Oh, what would someone have to do first if I wanted to make an a posteriori conlang? I almost made a slide about this in the presentation, but I didn't have time. There's sometimes a distinction between an a priori language, which is a language from nothing, that's not based on anything, it's just purely from your own mind, and an a posteriori conlang, which is a conlang that is based on another language. So, for example, if you wanted to create a conlang that was English spoken however many 100 years in the future, that would be an a posteriori language after English. And essentially the principles are exactly the same as doing any other kind of conlang. You just need to be aware of how the base language works and then modify it, think about how the grammar could realistically work and how the sound changes would happen to produce something new. A good example of an a posteriori conlang is David Peterson's work, Trigetta slang, which is he did for the 100. And yeah, it's a future version of English. And it's cool because you can see it's very obviously English, but when you hear it, it doesn't really sound like English. And you can still see the evidence of the structures in there. It's great fun.
All right, I think we have to wrap up because we have another meeting in 5 minutes. But
Keeps creating your most unholy language, BIBLARIDIon.
Should I stop sharing the screen then?
Yeah, I can just end the meeting. But thank you guys all for coming. Oh yeah, also.
Thank you for presenting, BIBLARIDIon.
Yes, definitely. And also, if you guys want to join the LingLeague Discord, a community of teens interested in linguistics, to learn more, we also have a Conlang channel. The link is in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much, BIBLARIDIon, for presenting. Like, again, incredible honor to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, the recording will be up on YouTube in a few days. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.